So I was watching Martin Liedtke's recent video where he was discussing the A Trip Down Market Street film from 1906, and it got me to asking a few questions and doing a little bit of research on a few things that he was showing. And then in that researching, I remembered that Market Street was regraded at some point, and I wondered how that would have affected the film that we see. And so I went to go look at my research that I had on that, and I could not find it. So I looked high and low, and I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked. And after about 3 hours of looking in my records and looking online, I didn't come up with nothing until I found a film that is discussing nothing but the regrading of San Francisco, California. So I feel like it's an important element to know that San Francisco was regraded in many ways. They lowered it, lowered the grade, they raised the grade, they filled in land. They did all kinds of things to this area that I don't believe a lot of people know about. And finding information on it is very difficult. So I would like to share this film with you, and I hope you enjoy. Love, Bigs.
San Francisco's better-known neighborhoods are stunning. Many people believe that the city's grids originated from its early flatlands and were simply extended up from those level lands over and onto its hills. In reality, there was not much level land in original San Francisco. The lands we now know as flat were not. They were deliberately created by the city's early elites and gold rush entrepreneurs who participated in a process that erased the original landscape of San Francisco. I live and work in SOMA, a flat area in San Francisco, south of Market Street. Compared to San Francisco's hills, SOMA is drab. But if you look closely, SOMA is full of strange and curious streets and buildings. A building with animated furniture. Buildings built as if each obeyed a different gravity, held to a different center of the earth, hinting at another time when the city was perhaps lower than it is now. San Francisco is surrounded by salt water on three sides, yet SOMA has a public fountain that celebrates San Francisco's founding of the United Nations. The fountain operates day and night as if fresh water were abundant and free. If there is construction, new buildings seem to reach deep into the ground. SOMA.com offices look out across a water channel to foundation pilings pounded into the earth for a University of California Medical Research Lab or school built over what was once the San Francisco Bay. Construction has just started on a 23-story addition to this apartment building. Hollow steel tubes are being twisted into the ground at the bottom of an excavation that itself is 30 to 40 feet below street level. The tubes have serrated leading edges. They have now sunk 140 feet below street level, half the height of the completed building next door. Yet at this depth, solid ground lies far below that. Several weeks later, the tubes have been filled with reinforcing steel and concrete. A temporary white pipe dewatering system has been installed. Water lies 60 to 70 feet below street level. It is copious, clear, and fresh. 3 blocks away, several years ago, in the summer of 2010, workmen were digging looking for a city water main here on 7th Street. They need to bring water to the newly built Mercy Care and Health Center seen beyond. The workmen have just found that main, and the foreman tells me he has never seen a main so deep. It is 12 feet below the street, and they have found evidence of previous lower levels of 7th Street, each marked by cobblestone. Here in central flat San Francisco, there is something about the land that feels out of sight below the surface. It is a common assumption that the street grid of San Francisco was easily applied to its flatlands, yet difficult to impose on its famous hillsides. Yet the early flatlands of the city were created out of landscapes quite different from what we know today. These level lands were more like the rolling hills and valleys of Golden Gate Park, but without the park's current vegetation. In the early decades of its life, San Francisco turned a large, outlying dune field into Golden Gate Park. At the same time, it took even larger inline dune fields and erased their ridges, peaks, ravines, creeks, lagoons, marshes, and bays, turning them into the level ground that we know today as Union Square, the Tenderloin, south of Market, and the Mission. The commencement, justification, propagation, and control of this massive erasure of original landscape centered on how San Francisco came to build its streets. This well-known film, A Trip Down Market Street, taken a week before the Great Earthquake in 1906, heads towards the bay and the ferry building. We transition to a CAD model of San Francisco's 1852 landform as it was documented by the U.S. Coast Survey. Twin Peaks lies ahead. In 1852, Market Street stops before reaching Kearny. An 80-foot sand dune lies straight ahead and to the left. Going over this dune, 3 blocks further west, we reach what is now the San Francisco cable car turnaround at Market and Powell. Cable cars climb Powell up to Union Square, which is surrounded by major stores and hotels. In the early 1850s, Union Square was not a flat plaza on a gradual slope up from Market. Instead, it lay amid sand dunes and gullies. Powell Street steepens as the cable car ascends Nob Hill. At California Street, we turn and look downhill. Most of these high-rise buildings rise out of what was once San Francisco Bay. This is the area originally known as Yerba Cove. American San Francisco began here, centered around the Cove's plaza known as Portsmouth Square. Before the gold rush, there were 3 small, widely dispersed settlements: Yerba Cove, the remains of the Spanish mission founded in 1776, 2.6 miles to the southwest inland, and the remnant of the small Spanish military outpost, the Presidio, overlooking the Golden Gate 5 miles northwest of both the mission and the Cove. In 1837, before the gold rush, Jean-Jacques Viognier drew a simple depiction of the Cove's property and street layout. In 1849, 459 people lived in Yerba Cove. The gold rush had started. 6 years later, the Cove grew 100-fold to 50,000 people. This growth was enabled by surveyor Jasper O'Farrell's 1847 reworking of the Viognier map, rectifying it into a Cartesian grid by which Yerba Cove could be extended and its land speculated on, subdivided, sold, and bought. It was said that many of these streets had no names until O'Farrell's work named them. An 1849 iteration of the O'Farrell street plan introduced Market Street, a future grand boulevard twisted off the Cove's grid, anchored at one end in the bay and aimed at the other to Twin Peaks, 4.5 miles to the west. The 1852-53 U.S. Coast Survey shows the Yerba Cove areas filling up with buildings. The 1857 Coast Survey shows the city encroaching on and effectively blocked by the steep rock slopes of Telegraph Hill to the northeast, the wind and water currents of the bay to the north, the steep rock slopes of Russian Hill and Nob Hill to the west. Remember, the cable car would not appear for another 20 years. Yerba Cove quickly expanded into the bay. The cove was shallow near its shoreline. Ships anchored further out in the bay to avoid beaching themselves at low tide. Soon, long wood wharfs extended the cove streets out to meet the moored ships. In the earliest days of the gold rush, many incoming ships were abandoned as crews jumped ship seeking gold in the Sierras. Some of these ships sank and burned, while others became shops and warehouses along the extended wharf streets. The shallow cove waters were soon filled, and the wharves became plank streets leading to yet newer wharves that extended further out into the bay. This process of establishing the location and heights of wharf streets and then filling in between those streets would become a model for how San Francisco would consume and erase its original landscape in order to grow itself flat land. San Francisco at Yerba Buena Cove was effectively landlocked on its west, north, and east sides, an intolerable situation for a city with explosive population growth and strategic importance to the nation. People have asked why the O'Farrell plan did not simply extend the Yerba Buena Cove grid into the dunes instead of creating a new grid aligned with a wide-angled Market Street. The proposal was controversial at the time. T.F. Prendergast wrote, "An indignation meeting was held to protest against the plan and wanton disregard for the rights of landowners, and the mob, for such it was, decided for lynch law." A friend warned O'Farrell before the crowd had dispersed. He found it discreet to remain some time in the country before venturing to return to the city. Market Street was an audacious proposal. Its layout could not have been more difficult to realize, as it proposed immense earth-moving challenges. The SOMA dunes were nothing less than the eastern end of a great sand dune field originating 7 miles to the west at the Pacific Ocean and stretching all the way to the bay. The SOMA sand dunes had been blown in and shaped for thousands of years by wind, fog, and rain coming off the Pacific Ocean. The sands lay over large bands of underlying rock. Here we see the Alcatraz terrain poking up from the dunes to form Telegraph, Russian, Knob, and Rincon Hills. A Franciscan complex melange pokes through the dune fields, creating Lone Mountain, Alamo Square, Clinton Mound, and Potrero Hill. Had Market Street been constructed atop these dunes in 1852, it would have been a great roller coaster ride. Here at Market in Montgomery begin a series of sand hills and gullies. An 80-foot tall dune ridge on the left stretches across Market Street. The Clinton Mound lie ahead, reaching a peak of over 180 feet above Van Ness. Was Market Street really created to make a major urban design statement, a grand boulevard tied to the bay and to one of the city's more distinctive hilltops? That may have been a stated justification, but O'Farrell and the city power structure were not just seeking to enlarge Yerba Buena Cove. They sought to grow San Francisco into the Mission, where large tracts of existing flat land lay southeast of Mission Dolores. How the O'Farrell plan accomplished this are told in the story of how SOMA and the Mission were first developed as a place of amusement and debauchery for the people of Yerba Buena Cove. The new south of Market blocks were larger than those in the Cove. Numbered streets would run perpendicular into Market Street, quickly connecting SOMA to the Cove. This 1851 panorama was shot from the southern corner here at First and Howard Streets. Historian Robert S. Hittle wrote, "Numerous houses arrived in pieces on shipboard from eastern cities and were put up, some of them south of Market in Happy Valley. However, Happy Valley was only connected to the Cove at First Street. Second and Third Streets could not immediately be tied to Market Street as long as an 80-foot dune stood in the way. Just a block to the south lay Pleasant Valley, on the other side of a 40-foot tall dune. Life in the early SOMA dune fields was lived intimately amid landscapes of rising and falling sand. This panorama was shot from the southern corner of what is now called Pioneer Square, here at 1st and Howard Streets. Even greater obstacles lay in the way of a land connection between Yerba Buena Cove and the Mission. Early in the gold rush, travel between these points was by boat, departing Yerba Buena Cove, heading on the bay towards Rincon Hill, and around to Steamboat Point, proceeding into Mission Bay, and navigating up Mission Creek into docks amid marshes. Mission Dolores was another 2/3 of a mile ride up a long, gentle slope on what would become 16th Street. In contrast, the overland passage between the Cove and Mission was very difficult. Charles Lockwood wrote, "Despite its proximity to San Francisco, the Mission District was often a several-hour ride or walk in 1850 because the trail between the church and Portsmouth Square went through a swamp, several creeks, and numerous sand hills. At the time, 2 bar owners noted, horses' hooves made no sound on the trail because they sank deep into the unresisting sand at each step." Written in 1855, the Annals of San Francisco wrote, "The land was one continuing succession of bleak sand hills, a hollow among miserable-looking sand hills which are scantily covered with stunted trees, worthless shrubs, and tufted weeds. It extends over a large space of ground and is still among the most dreary and melancholy spots that surround the city. The din of the city could not penetrate there. The only sound sometimes heard was the mournful requiem of distant waters of the bay when stirred to solemn music by a gale. It would seem that few people at the time saw any value in these sandfields, marshes, and creeks. Early San Franciscans were largely young males seeking fortune and adventure. The inaccessibility of the Mission and its early expanses of horizontal land meant they became a special magnet for Yerba Buena's early population. The Annals noted in an 1853 entry that the Mission was a favorite place of amusement to the citizens of San Francisco. Here in the early days of the city, exhibitions of bull and bear fights frequently took place, which attracted great crowds, and there were also numerous duels fought, which drew nearly as many idlers to watch them. At present, there are 2 race courses in the neighborhood and a large number of drinking houses. Today we think of streets as built and maintained by the city, but in early San Francisco this was not always the pattern. Though Market Street was laid out on the O'Farrell plan, the plan's first major street to be built was Mission Street, and it was built with private funds. Led by Colonel C.W. Wilson, investors secured state legislative approval in November of 1850 to build the Mission Plank Road. Work began immediately and was complete by spring. The Mission Plank Road began at California Street in the Cove and extended Kearny towards the 80-foot dune at Market Street. A narrow, deep ravine was cut through the dune. Kearny crossed the path of a future Market Street and then twisted slightly to become 3rd Street. The Mission Plank Road then turned and became Mission Street, heading for some distance before bending and cutting through a 60-foot dune to open into the Mission District and end at 16th Street. Hittel noted, "The toll on it was $50 for a horse and cart and $1 for a 4-horse team. Mission Street was preferred for the route rather than Market because the latter was occupied from 2nd to 5th by a high ridge. The chief expense of the enterprise was the grading, including deep cuts through several sandhills crossing Kearny Street." There are no photographs of the Plank Road, though the CAD model shows this remarkable cut through the dunes at Mission and Kearny. 7 years later, all evidence of these dunes would disappear, and by 1890, this intersection would become the home of the major newspapers of San Francisco and the American West, housing the high-rise offices of the Spreckels family Call newspaper and Bulletin newspaper, Michael DeYoung's Chronicle, and William Randolph Hearst's Examiner. Hittel's history observed that the SOMA marshes, which he called swamps, seemed buildable as much of it was covered by a thick mat of turf or peat. One of the features of the road was a bridge about 100 feet long built across a swamp that extended from near the corner of Mission and 7th in an eastward direction to Mission Bay. The road company made a contract for the construction of this bridge upon pile foundations, but that plan had to be abandoned because, to the astonishment and dismay of the contractor, the first pile, 40 feet long, at the first blow of the pile driver sank out of sight, indicating that there was no bottom within 40 feet to support a bridge. One pile having disappeared, the contractor hoisted another immediately over the first, and in 2 blows drove the second one down beyond the reach of the hammer. It was supposed that the second pile had driven the first one under it, and if so, there was no foundation within 80 feet. The project of piling was abandoned, and cribs of logs were made to lay upon the turf so as to get a wider basis than that offered by the piles. The bridge thus made always shook when crossed by heavy teams, and gradually settled till it was in the middle about 5 feet below the original level. This 3.5-mile road cost $96,000 to build at the time. Several years later, pressure mounted for a free public road, yet Wilson again secured authorization to build a second private road, the Folsom Plank Road. Hittel wrote, "The Folsom Street Road ran for nearly a half-mile across swamps between 3rd and 8th Street, and the builders had serious difficulty in filling up with sand until the permanent roadbed was made. In 1854, a high tide overflowed the road between 4th and 5th Streets and floated off the planking. After 1858, both plank roads became free. The Bryant Plank Road came next." A major beer garden, Rust Garden, was built in 1853 by a German family to adjoin their new SOMA residence. The Russes would eventually build increasingly grand hotels and significant office buildings in the city. Rust Gardens was accessed off the Mission Plank Road and located on the edge of a long yet 300-foot narrow sandbar separating the main SOMA marsh from its smaller cousin to the south. In this etching, the mountain behind the gardens is the now removed Potrero Hill Peak that came to be known as Irish Hill. The annals of San Francisco told of Rust Gardens' opening. May Day was celebrated by a large number of our German citizens in a cheerful and imposing style. The Gymnastic Musical Union marched with banners flying and musical instruments sounding to the gardens of Mr. Rush near the Mission Road. There, somewhere around 1,800 persons leaped, balanced, twirled, danced, sang, smoked, and made merry. Today, the site of Rust Gardens is an abandoned car wash at 6th Street and Harrison. 2 years earlier, with the opening of the Mission Plank Road, came the Pioneer Race Course set on the naturally flat land of the southern half of the Mission District. In 1853, the Union Race Course opened between the Pioneer Race Course and Mission Dolores, pear-shaped to avoid 60-foot ravines on its north and east sides that descended to the creeks and streams of the northern half of the Mission District. Then as now, the Mission District had the best weather of any San Francisco district. The city's large central mountains shielded the Mission District from westerly winds and fog, leaving the Mission sunny when the rest of the city might otherwise be in fog. The 2 race courses were wide, expansive venues for gambling, sunshine, and serious drinking. A traveling circus wintered at the Pioneer Race Course. Today, all that remains of the Pioneer Race Course is Garfield Square, a city park in the Mission. In 1857 came the Willows, the second major beer garden outside the Cove, set in a 4-acre park that was located about 40 feet below this spot at what is now 18th and Mission Street, in the northern half of the Mission District. A camera set up at the Union Race Course took this picture with Mission Dolores in the background and the Willows set in its natural ravine. Mission Street descended down into this ravine, crossing the sometimes above ground but mostly below ground 18th Street Creek. The street then rose out of the ravine and headed to the south to the Union and Pioneer race courses. The creek combined waters from Eureka Valley and Castro and flowed down 18th Street and was joined by other creeks from Noe Valley. An ad for the Willows notes that all kinds of refreshments, including meals, will be found at this place in a manner which shall give satisfaction. A poster lists a lineup of singers and entertainers performing at the Willows Exhibition Hall. Charles Lockwood noted, serious drinkers gathered at the Willows on Mission Street. It was not by accident that the resort's trees were willow trees. Christopher Richard of the Museum of California in Oakland has studied the Bay Area's creek ecosystems, which he has termed saucil environments. Originating from freshwater springs on rocky hillsides, a creek runs underground, perhaps gaining volume from descending surface runoff and perhaps running underground, passing through a dune field. Saltwater-friendly willow trees, known as saucils in Spanish, mark the creek waters as they near saltwater. The creeks often emerge above ground in tidal marshes where their waters mix with the bay's saltwater. The marshes are rich in life forms as shrubs, fish, insects, and birds, all living in this transition zone between fresh to salt water between high and low tides. The 18th Street Creek passed by the Willows on its way to a tidal marsh, which in turn flowed into the small river known as Mission Creek that flowed into Mission Bay. Russ Garden Sandbar was itself covered with willows. Hittle's 1878 History of San Francisco noted that Russ Gardens was liberally patronized, especially on Sunday, until 1860, when the Market Street Railroad gave facilities to reach the Willows, a public garden. In 1866, it was superseded by Woodward's Gardens, which has since maintained its place in popular favor. Woodward's Gardens began as a private home built by General John C. Fremont before 1850, built against the southern edge of the SOMA dune field just as Mission Street emerged into the Mission District. The Mission Plank Road meant that his house was now accessible from the Cove. Robert Woodward bought the Fremont home and 4 of its acres in 1861. Woodward had made his fortune providing housing and dining services in Yerba Buena Cove during the gold rush. His hotel was the What Cheer House, and it had over 1,000 rooms and served hundreds of meals daily. A largely underground creek ran roughly down the future 14th Street, passing under the Woodward property on the southern edge of the SOMA dune fields. This was the Sans Souci Creek, carrying waters from the Lower Haight and DuBose Park areas that diverted around the rocky Clinton Mound, remaining underground except where diked and channeled, and emerging in narrow marshlands along the western edge of Mission Creek. As Joel Pomerantz has documented, a mammoth storm season hit Northern California in the winter of 1861 to 1862, washing down the 18th Street ravine and demolishing the willows, which would be rebuilt. That storm also created a large body of water in the DuBose area behind a sand dune, which broke open one evening, sending a wall of water down around the Clinton Mound and damaging Woodward's new home. Woodward made repairs and added a large greenhouse conservatory. He created ponds and streams in back of the conservatory, fed and drained into the otherwise underground Sans Souci Creek. Woodward collected plants, animals, objects, and artwork from extensive world travels and brought them back to his estate. He noted that passerbys were interested in his collections. By 1866, he had moved to the Napa Valley and opened up his San Francisco estate as a paid public attraction. Charles Lockwood wrote, "The first thing that visitors saw was Woodward's former home converted into the Museum of Natural Wonders. Next to the museum stood Woodward's Near Eastern-style conservatory, filled with exotic plants and flowers. Nearby, the rotary boat whirled around in a circular track at the edge of a pond as the children on board laughed and screamed with delight. Behind the pond stretched gravel paths that passed fountains, streams, small lakes, hillocks, and even man-made grottos and caverns. Woodward built an amphitheater where up to 5,000 men and women and children watched spectacles like the Delhi fire eaters, Siberian reindeer, Japanese acrobats, dancing bears, Roman chariot races, even Major Burke and his rifle review. It took me quite a while to realize that some of the Woodward Garden photographs were pictures of one of the last remaining SOMA dunes, albeit a dune that had become heavily landscaped over time, precisely what was being done to the dunes out near the Pacific Ocean in Golden Gate Park. A low, temple-like structure stood atop the 80 to 100-foot tall Woodward dune. Later, the little temple was replaced by a massive exhibition complex atop that dune, and the temple was returned as an ornament on its roof. The back of the little temple sits directly on its dune, and the top of the early conservatory lies just beyond in this 1860 TE height photograph of the SOMA dune field as seen from the top of the Clinton Mound, with scruffy versions of Market and Valencia streets below in the foreground. The intensity of the SOMA fields can be sensed in this photograph, where two-story buildings lie scattered and dwarfed and shadowed by much taller dunes. A cluster of dunes reach to an 80 to 100-foot high peak centered on what is now 10th Street between Mission and Howard. We see that peak here in this photograph from atop the Woodward dune. By 1869, the U.S. Coast Survey shows a SOMA that is almost now totally level, its dunes completely removed except for those west of Mission Street, such as the Woodward dune. In this 1878 Muybridge panorama shot, the rear of the massive, newly built Woodward Gardens exhibition complex is seen here behind the new City Hall under construction. The bulk of SOMA stretches as a flat plain sloping down towards Mission Creek and Mission Bay. From roughly 1850 through 1869, the bulk of SOMA's landscape was erased, and between the closure of Woodward Gardens in 1891 and the early 1900s, the remainder of SOMA's dunes and the bulk of the Clinton Mound were removed as well. Where Woodward Gardens had once been, there is now a stretch of flat city blocks. Where the ponds and water amusements were, and where the exhibition complex sat atop the Woodward dune, there is now small blocks of conventional warehouses and apartments. And in the basement of the Armory today runs an open waterway, reminiscent of the Sans Souci Creek that provided water amusements to the gardens. Mission Dolores today looks content, sitting among buildings in a streetscape that developed almost a century after it was built in 1776. Only if we strip away these neighboring buildings can we see how it was originally sited. The Mission had been built upslope from Mission Creek on a broad plain set halfway between a dugout and channeled Sans Souci Creek, which supplied it with drinking water, and the 18th Street Creek in its 40 to 60 foot deep ravine that provided water and grazing for the mission's animals. Pirate attacks on the earlier First California missions had led many to be rebuilt uphill away from previous Pacific Ocean shoreline sites. Mission Dolores from this inland location had sweeping views across the Mission District, out past the SOMA dunes out to Mission Bay. At Mission Dolores, folks could see well in advance who was coming up Mission Creek. Mission Dolores has none of these views today. When American San Francisco was founded at Yerba Buena Cove, Mission Dolores was in shambles. The California mission system had closed by 1825. The Mission was, among other things, a hotel called the Mansion House, sharing space with saloons, dance halls, gambling dens, and brothels, heavily populated by white folk. The Annals of San Francisco described the Mission Chapel in 1853 as a dark, cold, comfortless place. Public worship is still regularly celebrated in this huge and gloomy temple. The usual audiences are a few women whose features and dress proclaim their Spanish origin. Mission Street was not the through street that it is today. Through 1859, it stopped at a long ravine after dropping folks off at the Union and Pioneer race courses. This was the Procida Creek Ravine, set between the southern edge of the Mission District and Bernal Heights. Procida Creek drained the slopes of Diamond Heights, Dolores Heights, Glen Park, Noy Valley, and Bernal Heights, and headed eastward down its increasingly deep ravine to empty into a marsh at the foot of the northeast corner of Bernal Heights. From there, the marsh emptied into the large Islas Creek Marsh, which in turn emptied into San Francisco Bay. A stone wall and street zigzagged along the southern edge of the Mission called the Serpentine, following the course of Procida Creek. And on the Bernal side of the ravine, Procida Road zigzagged parallel to the Serpentine. Much of Procida Road remains, though only a few snippets of the Serpentine are left. Bernal Heights and Potrero Hill were pasture lands for cattle and goats. The Serpentine may have been a pasture wall, keeping Bernal's cattle confined to the creek and to the heights for grazing. A similar long stone wall ran along the eastern edge of the southern half of the Mission District, separating the Pioneer Race Course from Potrero Hill's grazing animals. This is Mission Street at Cesar Chavez today, where a crooked one-block stretch of Cap Street is the remnant of the Serpentine. In 1888, this is what this area looked like. Mission Street and Cesar Chavez are raised 25 feet above the Procida Creek Ravine, which is seen sloping below the roadways. This 1896 photograph looks across Procida Park in Bernal Heights towards the Procida Ravine running behind the buildings on the far left. A half-mile downstream from Mission Street, we see Alabama Street coming off Bernal Heights, crossing the ravine on a raised roadway to head towards what had been the Pioneer Race Course. With the fire from the 1906 Great Earthquake burning in the background, Folsom Street is seen coming down from Bernal, crossing the ravine on a raised roadway. Just as in the filling in of Yerba Buena Cove, between its elevated wharves, Procida Creek was filled in between its raised roadways, creating the much less deep depression through which Cesar Chavez Street now runs. Unlike the Hayes Creek and the 18th Street Creek, Procida Creek was put into a culvert running under its raised roadway streets in 1878. Yet surface and spring waters that previously drained into it and may not be captured in street drains today seek out the old creek ravine. As the original impermeable silts that lined the creek bottom were probably not systematically removed, the old creek beds continue to accept and impound fresh waters. Over time, the rise and fall of this water and the subsidence of the ravine fill material and the effects of earthquakes and soil liquefaction have resulted in seemingly random building formations along Cesar Chavez. These deformations occur in structures that lie directly over Procida Creek's original zigzag path. From the gold rush through 1906, we see San Francisco lot by lot, block by block, erasing its landscape to create level land on which to grow. For a long time, I was struck by a question. If development was done piecemeal by individual private investors buying and speculating on land, building businesses and transportation elements, why didn't a haphazard landscape emerge with stormwaters and sewer lines running into undrainable low points at random locations throughout the city? Yet the creation of all this new landscape over 5 decades was somehow coordinated so that stormwater and sewage now flow systematically to a line of low-lying collection drains set in what was once Mission Creek and Mission Bay. Greg Braswell of the San Francisco Department of Public Works gave me the answer. The state of California, at its inception, allotted to itself the right to establish the heights of San Francisco's streets. Regardless of the original disposition of the land that an individual might buy, the state, and later the city, had the right to establish and then reestablish the elevation points for all streets. A property owner thus had to build to those street elevations, and if those points were changed yet again, the owner was obliged to rebuild to the new street elevations. An early use of this power occurred in Yerba Buena Cove. Hittel wrote, "If the shoreline had remained where it was in 1850, the grade then adopted would have been sufficient. But the filling in of Yerba Buena Cove and the pushing of the waterfront from its near natural position to a place 1,000 feet further east made it necessary for purposes of drainage to raise the level of many of the streets. The new grades of 1853 imposed a heavy expense on those who had already built of brick." The most famous use of this power was the 2nd Street cut through Rincon Hill. We saw earlier the 80-foot dune that blocked the connection of Market Street to 2nd and 3rd Streets in Happy Valley. By 1857, that dune, and the dunes that were Happy Valley itself, had been removed. The new lands between Market Street and Rincon were now flat and used for housing and workshops for the city's booming mining and maritime fabricators. Cutting down hills and dunes not only directly created flat land, it provided the fill for turning the marshes and ravines into flat land as well. Braswell noted that deals were made to move soil off of one individual's property over to another's for fill, perhaps some distance away. This work was done by Irish labor crews using horse carts. At other times, steam shovels using temporary rail cars were used. Hittel noted that the steam paddy was a scoop which at one move could dig up a cubic yard of sand or gravel, nearly twice as much as could be hauled by a single horse in a cart, and then swing it round by a crane over a railroad car into which the load was discharged. It was at work from 1852 until 1854, and from 1859 till 1873, almost constantly, sometimes moving 25,000 tons a day, and for a while 2 were employed. In an 1851 entry, the Annals of San Francisco noted, "The steam paddy had been set to work, rapidly cutting away the numerous sandhills that lay between the plaza, Portsmouth Square, and Happy Valley. The rubbish was conveyed by temporary rails along streets and emptied into the bay at those parts where already roads were laid out and houses built on piles." With 2nd Street connected to Market Street, Rincon developed into the city's first elite residential neighborhood in the late 1850s. But as SOMA's flat land and its industries and worker housing grew, Rincon was increasingly in the way. 2nd Street had to climb 80 feet up and over Rincon to make its way to the developing industry and shipping areas south of the hill, where a Chinese fishing village and some docks and warehouses were earlier. The end of the Civil War brought the prospects of the Transcontinental Railroad terminating in newly leveled SOMA land at 3rd and Townsend. In 1869, the California State Legislature approved the lowering of 2nd Street at Rincon Hill. The cut was massive and into rock. After it was completed, much of Rincon remained, including the residency of some of its most prominent occupants, even though Nob Hill and Pacific Heights were soon to become the locale of the upper class. The Donahue family, founders of Happy Valley's Union Iron Works that evolved into San Francisco's major shipyard, lived here on Bryant between 1st and 2nd for decades. The Harrison Street Bridge spanned 2nd Street, connecting the two otherwise severed parts of the hill. Rincon burnt to the ground in the 1906 quake. Today, it is impossible to get a tangible sense of what was taken away, as 2nd Street now gently slopes through this area. A few years later came the removal of the 100-foot tall Steamboat Point Hill, now flat land at 2nd and Townsend. The long horizontal lines of the railroad and its nearby terminal, side yards, and warehouses are captured in Muybridge's 1879 panorama. Over the next 30 years, SOMA would grow into an industrial mini-city, caught in this recollection pinned by Jack London. Old San Francisco was divided midway by the slot, an iron crack that ran under the center of Market Street, and from the slot arose this burr of ceaseless, endless cable that was hitched at will to the cars to be dragged up and down. North of the slot were the theaters, hotels, shopping districts, the banks, the staid and respectable business houses. South of the slot were the factories, slums, laundries, machine shops, collier works, and the abodes of the working class. Hittel estimated that the total amount of earth moving throughout San Francisco from 1840 until 1878 amounted to the transfer of 21 million cubic yards from hill to hollow. The U.S. Coast Survey, now the U.S. Geodetic Survey, is a part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and is distinct from the USGS, or United States Geologic Survey. The U.S. Coast Survey was created by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807 to survey the coasts, a critical tool for a new nation dependent on river and ocean transport. As the U.S. began its expansion into the West, the Coast Survey soon followed. In early June 1850, 3 U.S. Coast Survey scientists arrived at Yerba Buena Cove. They found the cove filled with hundreds of abandoned ships and the new city leveled by fire, one of several conflagrations that burnt the cove from 1849 through 1851. They had come to establish the survey's West Coast office in San Francisco. Their orders came from Washington, where they sent their sketches and notes back to be engraved and printed. The U.S. Coast Survey set to work on sites associated with hazardous shipping, Point Conception near Santa Barbara, and Cape Disappointment at the mouth of the Columbia River. Their efforts around San Francisco Bay included mapping ocean coastal areas leading to the Golden Gate and the strategically important naval site at Mare Island. The U.S. Coast Survey commenced a survey of the entire upper San Francisco peninsula, focusing on Yerba Buena Cove. During the Civil War, the West Coast offices were closed, as the Coast Survey focused on matters critical to the North's military victory over the South. Focused on maritime issues of strategic military and economic value, it seems odd that the U.S. Coast Survey should undertake the early and tedious task of surveying San Francisco's hills, dune fields, and marshes. Surveying sinuous, shifting, and difficult-to-tread dunes and creek waterways could not have been easy. Yet the Coast Survey conducted this effort several times over a 20-year period, from its first mapping in 1852 to 1853, updated in 1857 and 1859, and then again after the Civil War in 1869. These surveys not only included important navigation landmarks such as the city's mountains and coastline, the surveys also included detail of creeks, buildings, small farms for a depth of 2 miles along the eastern side of San Francisco from Telegraph Hill to what is now Candlestick Park. The Coast Survey was not charged with mapping for the sake of historic documentation. From its beginning, Washington, D.C. understood San Francisco's importance as a key element in developing the American West and projecting the nation's priorities into the Pacific, a central point in Greybreck's seminal work, Imperial San Francisco. The U.S. Coast Survey's work to document San Francisco's dune fields, marshes, and bays meant that politicians, developers, investors, and engineers were given the data by which to understand the location and quantity of fill material needed to create the new flat land that the city would require in growing to become the nation's outpost on the coast. The creation of all this flat land was extraordinarily expensive, yet San Francisco was a gold rush city. Though its city government went in and out of being financially strapped, immense private wealth poured through the city, much of it ready for investment, speculation, and development in San Francisco. In 1849, $3 million in gold came through San Francisco, this in 1849 dollars. Within a few years, millions of dollars entered the city each month. In 1853 alone, $63 million in gold passed through. Nonetheless, the annals of San Francisco contain barbed comments on the constant building and rebuilding of the city's streets. In 1853 accounts, the annal notes, though there seemed to be comparative level land along Mission Creek shores, it required considerable expense, millions of dollars, to fill in water and remove sandhills, reworking streets and houses over and over again. A second and a third time, new and supposedly better street grades were being everywhere established. To carry these out, enormous and costly excavations had to be made at particular localities, while at others, immense mounds of earth had to be thrown down over deep valleys. Generally, the streets in the lower part of the city were raised several feet above the former height, while on the high grounds towards the north and west, the lines of streets had to be lowered from 10 to 50 feet. Although the city generally may in the end be much improved by the adoption of these grades, the necessity thereby created of excavating or filling up the building lots along the artificial street line and the raising or lowering of substantial buildings already erected to suit the new level has caused incalculable injury and loss to individual citizens. On viewing the sad destruction of property caused to particular persons by these new grades, we are only the more embittered against the original designers of the town for their absurd mathematical notions. If the great thoroughfares had been adapted to the natural configuration of the tract of country upon which the city stand, there might have been some apparent irregularity in the plan, and some perhaps little ground available for building purposes lost, yet many millions of dollars would have been saved to the community at large. Millions more must be spent in overcoming the obstacles willfully placed in the way by their originally defective plans. The authors of the Annals did not appreciate how the city was a vehicle for using private gold profits to level its land and grow an otherwise landlocked San Francisco originating from Yerba Buena Cove. We are back at the UN Fountain. Like other locations around Civic Center, the fountain's waters come from the Hayes Creek, running submerged throughout the Civic Center area. About 60 feet below Market Street runs the underground Muni Metro Tunnel. The BART Rapid Transit Line runs below that, 85 feet below the street. More than 2.5 million gallons of fresh water a week are pumped out of these tunnels and a station nearby. The Hayes Creek originally surfaced into two marshes. The head of its large main marsh now lies below this plaza and the new high-rise federal office building here at Mission and 7th Streets. This is where the Mission Plank Road's bridge forded the main Hayes Creek Marsh on logs atop its thick peat covering. In 1897, the federal government built San Francisco a new, elegant post office on the eastern shore of this marsh head. That post office is now the home of the well-known U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. During the 1906 earthquake, 7th Street sunk at the marsh's shoreline at various points around the post office. The post office was back in business 2 days later as human effort prevented a massive conflagration of the building in the post-earthquake firestorm. It did not hurt that the building's new braced steel frame had been carefully designed with earthquakes in mind. I have found only 2 photographs showing the Hayes marshes in their original state. In this 1865 photograph, the Mission and Folsom Plank roads run parallel through south of Market. Here, a long 40-foot-high dune structure is cut as it crosses Mission Street, rising up to 80 feet tall as it approaches the future path of Market Street heading towards a future Van Ness Avenue. This is the low-lying flat that is descending from Hayes Valley with the Hayes Creek waters running underneath, heading diagonally across future Market Street before emerging to the surface just before crossing Mission Street. And here, the headwaters of the main Hayes Marsh have already been filled in, replacing the Mission Plank Road's pontoon bridge. Remnants of the marsh are seen in the ponds that mark the marsh's path towards Mission Bay. This photograph of South Park near Rincon Hill was taken around the same time. Today, this is an area packed with design and mobile internet companies, and our view through the little park leads out to an expanse of flat SOMA lofts and warehouses. In 1856, South Park was an English-inspired upper-end townhouse development off 2nd Street. Straight ahead are both Hayes Creek marshes. To the left, you can see open bodies of water where these marshes merge with Mission Bay, just to the other side of the newly constructed Bryant Street Plank Road on the left, raised 15 feet above the water. The buildings in the background lie on the far side of the marshes. Behind them, a little to the right of South Park's central axis, are the SOMA Dune Field's high points centered on what is now 10th Street between Howard and Mission. South Park's windmill may be pumping potable water. Far from being picturesque, the marshes disguise themselves as simple flat land. Hittel describes the main Hayes Creek Marsh as a swamp that, heading near the corner of Mission and 7th Street, ran for a mile eastward to the bay with an average width of 300 yards, and a parallel marsh not so wide had its head near the crossing of Mission and 8th Streets. These were called swamps, but they seem to have been, for part of their area at least, subterranean lakes from 40 to 80 feet deep, covered by a crust of peat 8 to 10 feet thick. The peat in the marshes, especially near the heads, were strong enough to sustain a small house or loaded wagon, though a man, by swinging himself from side to side or jumping upon it, could give it a perceptible shiver. This explains how in the 1852 to 53 U.S. Coast Survey maps, not only the Mission Plank Road, but paths wander over the not yet filled marshes to the future site of Russ Gardens. Hittel continues, many ludicrous scenes occurred in the filling up of the swamps. More than once a contractor had put up enough sand to raise the street to the official grade and gave notice to the city engineer to inspect the work, but in the lapse of a day between the notice and the inspection, the sand had sunk 6 to 8 feet. The curious and tilted sunk buildings in SOMA today are largely confined to the areas over the Hayes Marshes. The eastern edge of the main Hayes Marsh runs just beyond this intersection at Howard and 6th Street. Today, the Wild Furniture Building is an unoccupied, condemned building that structurally failed in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. This building was rebuilt with diagonal steel beams strengthening its structural system. The corner building here failed and has been replaced by a new high-rise residential building. A block further down 6th Street towards Folsom, further into the marsh, a former resident tells me that in the 1989 earthquake, a large hole opened up in the street and a nearby building collapsed. A new high-rise apartment building now resides in its place. Down the side alley lies a remarkable sunken loft structure built after the 1906 earthquake. Here, at 6th Street and Bluxmy, over what was the conjuncture of the Hayes Marshes into Mission Bay, a brick warehouse office's cornice fell off in the 1989 quake, killing several people leaving or waiting to be picked up by friends from work. There are many factors behind earthquake damage. Inadequately braced buildings can be one factor. The length and intensity of ground shaking is another. When soil liquefies underground, the ground, rather than just transmitting earthquake movements, becomes itself a material fluid that loses its ability to support buildings, and being fluid, shakes longer and more violently than if the ground were solid. Underground water liquefied portions of the fill placed in the main Hayes Marsh in 1906 and 1989. It did not help that the water mains broke in liquefying soils, hampering firefighting and exacerbating soil conditions, as in this 1906 picture of the 16-inch diameter water main under 7th and Mission. O'Rourke and others have drawn maps of the current liquefaction potential in SOMA and the Mission District based on soil borings and computer models. In SOMA, these potentials map closely to the main Hayes Creek Marsh. For a 1906 magnitude earthquake, they project up to 13 to 20 feet of underground soil depth could liquefy in various parts of the marsh. One such place is here, below 5th Street between Shipley and Clara, between Folsom and Harrison. As in other parts of the Hayes Marsh, the open lots and backyards lie several feet below the street level, though the marsh here was filled in by 1869 and regraded several times later, including after the 1906 earthquake. Another locale of sizable liquefaction potential lies under 7th Street, between the Hayes Marsh head at Mission extending to Folsom Street. Remember the nighttime dig under 7th Street looking for the water main? The workers were connecting city water to the new Mercy Care Health Center. Here in 2009, excavations for that center have reached several feet below the facility's rear street and a high groundwater table has been encountered, with foundations going down yet another 15 feet to accommodate underground parking. Extensive site dewatering has commenced. For over a year, on a 24/7 basis, clear, salt-free water has been pumped out of this site. The water volume shows no seasonal variation. The Mercy Center lies in the main marsh, just inside its south shoreline. Across the street, a large warehouse used for parking now has sunk about 18 inches below 7th Street. At 7th and Howard, 3 out of the 4 corner buildings are new buildings replacing structures damaged in the 1989 earthquake. An older building on the southeast corner has been structurally retrofitted with diagonal steel bracing and new foundation work, yet the building, as with its 2 adjoining neighbors, has tilted in the past, as if falling backwards away from the intersection. On 7th, just up from Howard, near Natoma, in 1989, the structures on the right tilted and pulled away from the sidewalk as their rear portions, and likewise the sidewalk itself, sunk into the main Hayes Marsh. Over time, Howard Street has sunk about 18 inches compared to 7th. Cars on Howard rise up across 7th only to drop back down on the other side. Here are some of the most dramatic building settlements in south of Market. The warehouses on the left are level, yet those that lie over the southern shoreline of the main Hayes Marsh tilt into the marsh. Here are these same buildings in a 1944 photograph, just 38 years after the 1906 quake. The tilting is similar, but Howard Street itself is level. What is going on? Greg Braswell notes that the old marsh beds were lined with sediments and clays, acting as a waterproof lining, keeping creek waters from seeping quickly into the underlying sand. Unlike Precita Creek, Hayes Creek was never placed in culverts. Fill material, largely dune sand, was simply dumped into the marshes, leaving the water impermeable bottoms intact. Filled, the marshes act like bowls with water-saturated soils. In the 140 years or so since the marshes were filled, these soils have compacted and subsided. Braswell notes that the marshes have settled uniformly except at their shorelines. Structures over the old dunes did not subside, while those over the marsh did, and those straddling the shores tilted into the marsh. Why does Howard Street rise and fall as it crosses 7th Street? Braswell notes that the city's main sewer lines in SOMA and the Mission run in the numbered streets like 7th or 18th Street, descending across the expanse of man-made flat land into collection sewers that run in what was once Mission Creek and Mission Bay. Many of these main sewer lines remain and were built in the 1800s of brick on foundation piles that kept them from subsiding. In this way, the system's overall drainage grades have been maintained for over 100 years. Here on 6th Street, over what was once Mission Bay, the sewer maintains its elevation and thus cracks the land that settles around it. The same is happening on Marin Street in land settling into what was once the large Islas Creek Marsh. Over time, the city has reworked the sidewalks and streets to raise them back into relationship with their sewers. As a result, some buildings appear to have sunk below the sidewalks, whereas it is the streets and sidewalks that have been raised. Setting street heights independent from adjacent buildings is something that the city has always done. Here on Howard, the marsh has subsided 18 inches or more since the 1944 photograph. Yet the 7th Street sewer has kept its original elevation, and 7th Street has been raised accordingly, last time after the 1989 earthquake. Thus cars are coming from the main Hayes Marsh up over 7th Street, dipping down again over the marsh, and then ascending up over the marsh's shoreline. We see the same thing happening on Natoma, an alleyway just north, as cars descend from the dune field, slip down as they head into the marsh, ascend 7th Street, and return down into the marsh on the other side. This warehouse is located over the narrow sandbar that once straddled the 2 Hayes Creek marshes, across the street from where Russ Gardens had once been. The business fronts on Columbia Street. In 1906, the northern part of Columbia, over the main marsh, subsided. A half a block away on Folsom, this building sits over the shoreline between the sandbar and the main marsh, tilting into the marsh. Not all the former marsh and shoreline areas show pronounced deformations today. We are at 9th Street and Brannan, in a perfectly level area that was once over Mission Creek 2 blocks from where it emptied into Mission Bay. The O'Rourke maps call it as a site where between 13 to 20 feet of fill material will have high liquefaction potential. In 1906, astounding liquefaction damage occurred here on 9th Street. Down this parking lot mid-block, homes imploded. At the other side of this block, houses at the northern end of Dory listed into the soil, while the street sunk near its southern end. Public memory of the San Francisco impact of the 1989 Bay Area earthquake focuses on building collapses and fires in the Marina District, a district created by filling in a tidal marsh on the north side of the city. The press and the internet show dramatic collapsed corner marina apartments. These buildings were slammed into by adjoining structures, but themselves did not have adjoining structures on their opposite sides against which to rebound. These were older structures without sufficient lateral bracing. They were essentially pushed into the streets by their neighbors. In 1906 earthquake, one of the most dramatic and well-publicized building collapses took place in the Mission District, the Valencia Hotel. More than 100 people died here. It turns out that the hotel was built on 40 to 50 feet of fill dumped into the 18th Street Creek Ravine at Valencia between 18th and 19th Street, at the western edge of what had been the large Willows Resort. And the Valencia Hotel was in effect a 4-story building built on a corner with half a block's worth of adjacent buildings to its south and a vacant lot immediately to its north. Officer Powell was leaving the all-night cafe in the Valencia Hotel when the earthquake struck. He wrote, "Valencia Street not only began to dance and rear up and roll in waves like a rough sea in a squall, but it sank in places and then vomited up its car tracks and the tunnels that carried the cables. The hotel lurched forward as if the foundations were dragged behind from under it and crumpled down over Valencia Street. It telescoped down on itself like a concertina. All this took only a few seconds." The hotel's occupants were said to have drowned in subsoil water. A bit later, the water line in front of the hotel burst open, creating a large sinkhole and effectively cut off water needed for firefighting efforts throughout the rest of the city. You can see the tilting, sinking, and collapse of buildings along both sides of Valencia between 18th and 19th Street. The O'Rourke study finds a 19-foot deep area centered on the Valencia Hotel site susceptible to liquefaction during a seismic event of the magnitude of the 1906 quake. Further downstream, on the other side of the Willows Resort grounds, the 18th Street Creek became a marsh between Mission and Folsom Streets from 17th to 18th Streets. In the early 1900s, this area had been raised about 20 feet to be level with its surroundings. In 1906, this was an area of severe ground liquefaction. The east side of what is now South Van Ness between 17th and 18th was not burnt in the firestorm, so it was well photographed as houses sank, some collapsing into one another. I visited this street after the 1989 earthquake. At first glance, everything seemed normal. In place of the ruined 1906 houses are a line of low-rise commercial shops set back from South Van Ness, yet nestled several feet below street level. I took a more careful look at the few apartments that remained on this block and realized that I could put my hand through the exterior walls between the bottom of their lower floors as their foundations had sunk into the ground in certain areas. We are on the opposite side of this block, looking at the west side of Shotwell Street, further into the 18th Street Creek Marsh. The backyards of this entire block have settled a full 6 to 10 feet below street level. These new homes stand where older wood apartments sunk and tilted in 1989. I talked to some of the residents of the tilted apartments, and they told me of hearing loud noises from the earth as water and mud billowed up around their buildings while their apartments listed and sank. The San Francisco papers published no photographs of this damage. My favorite burrito place at the time was a block away on the corner of Folsom at 18th. In 1989, the building appeared untouched, but a look inside had shown that the burrito shop had sunk several feet into the ground. The O'Rourke study finds a 19-foot deep area of potential liquefaction stretching from under this general area from the middle of Shotwell over to the burrito shop. UC Berkeley professor Stephen Tobrinner's map of the origin points of the 1906 firestorm fires shows a heavy concentration in the main Hayes Marsh area. A map of ground-shaking intensity shows increased intensity within the main Hayes Marsh. Maps of major damage to civilian and to fire department water mains, breaks, major streets and land subsidence all show damage in areas over the main Hayes Marsh. Major damage is also found throughout the 18th Street Creek and its marsh. Interestingly, minimal damage is reported for lands over the secondary Hayes Creek Marsh, Mission Bay, and most of the 14th Street Creek path. Sand itself is not necessarily a liability. Much of San Francisco is built upon old dune fields that have been leveled and filled in. The bulk of the Tenderloin, Hayes Valley, the Haight, the Panhandle, parts of the Richmond, and parts of the Sunset. In 1906 and 1989, many low-rise, light wood-framed buildings in those areas suffered little, if any, damage. The presence of water that saturates sand or fill material seems to set the conditions for seismic liquefaction. Whereas Golden Gate Park is celebrated and assumed by some to be what San Francisco would have been had it not been developed, the central San Francisco flatlands are assumed to be what the city was originally, but altered by the spread of dense buildings. Yet both of these areas were man-made around the same time, created out of the same landforms using the same construction methods. At Golden Gate Park, the dune fields, creeks, and ravines were deliberately transformed in an image of English countryside. In SOMA and the Mission, the same landscape was transformed in the image of a 19th century industrial town complete with factories, smokestacks, smog, workers' housing, and slums. Let's take a fast 1-minute drive down Folsom Street from the north slopes of Bernal Heights to the Embarcadero and San Francisco Bay. Heading towards Cesar Chavez Street, suspended as it is above what was the Presida Creek ravine. Up out of the ravine onto the high, flat plain that was once the Pioneer Racecourse. Here between 23rd to just past 20th, the Union Racecourse. Sloping downward, heading towards the 18th Street Creek Marsh. Between 18th and 19th Streets, heading over the Sans Souci Creek Plain. Up ahead, at the Central Freeway, a SOMA sand hill, 4 times taller than this freeway. Bending through the SOMA dune field on the route of the Folsom Plank Road, the dune field's 80 to 100 foot high point lies up ahead, a block to the left here on 10th. Descending towards the secondary Hayes Creek Marsh, which starts just after 8th. Passing over the sandbar here at 7th. Passing into the main Hayes Creek Marsh. Coming up from the marsh onto the main Hayes Creek shoreline that cuts through the middle of the modern Yerba Buena Lofts complex on the right. Passing Moscone Center on the left, ascending what is left of Rincon Hill. passing over the 2nd Street cut and moving down towards the bay. Its shoreline here, just before Fremont Street. We drive well above what was once the bay. It has taken us 60 seconds to traverse a landscape that was erased in 60 years with the help of gold and thousands of investments to become the city of San Francisco.
Say woof again! Say woof again!
I've got one that can see.
This is my kung fu, and it is strong.
See you later.